Today I thought I'd walk you through how I made this little blue truck quilt. This is one of our favorite books for story time in our house. So to get started, you are going to want fabric of your choice. You can make any character using this technique today. We're just going to be doing some applique. So go ahead and print off a template of any character that you would like. What I did was I zoomed in to about 500% on my computer and used my snipping tool on my computer to zoom in to different parts of Little Blue Truck and printed those off really large and then just taped them together like you could see on the template. Then you're going to take freezer paper and you're going to lay it over your printed template and just kind of draw out the outermost details and the outermost outline of whatever character that you're going to make. I went ahead and folded my fabric in half for Little Blue Truck, and I laid my template right where that fold was on the fabric. The reason I did that is because now I only have to cut once, and when I unfold that fabric, I'm going to have two symmetrical pieces that are attached together to make one big piece for the truck. So here I'm just ironing my freezer paper onto my fabric and then cutting out around the lines on the freezer paper so that I have my general shape for Little Blue Truck here, as you can see. Now I'm going to look and work on the finer details for Little Blue Truck. So I've got my frog here, and what I'm doing is cutting out the shape for the windshield. So you can see that here. I did cut two of these to match what Little Blue Truck looks like. And I just put the freezer paper on top and traced the outline. And now I'm going to lay these after I remove my freezer paper. You just peel it right off the fabric. I'm going to lay these down and just make sure that they kind of fit how I want them to before putting Heat and Bond on the back. So for this project, you're going to want Heat and Bond Lite. It's a sewable, fusible material that allows you to kind of fuse fabrics together. So you see that here, Heat and Bond Lite. Depending on what you're making for your applique, one pack might do it. It does come with a pretty large sheet. I don't think I even used half a pack for this entire project. So there's two ways that you can use this. You can either do what I'm doing here and cut to size roughly the amount of Heat and Bond that you need. There's a bumpy side on that Heat and Bond, and you're going to put that bumpy side down against your fabric and then hold your iron over it for a few seconds. The heat from the iron is going to allow that glue, as you can see here, I'm showing you kind of that rough bumpy side that goes to the fabric. The heat from the iron is going to allow that glue to fuse to your fabric. And then what you'll do, which I'll show you in a minute, once that cools down, is you'll kind of peel that backing off and it'll have a nice shiny side. And then you'll use your iron again to press the fabric onto your other fabric to help it stick together. So again, just showing you now I've peeled that Heat and Bond off and you see that shine. That's the adhesive that's on my fabric now. So when I lay my iron on top of that fabric, the white fabric will now stick to the blue fabric, so that later on I can stitch that down for a more permanent attachment. You don't have to hold your iron on for very long, just a couple seconds in each area should do it. And I like to work my way from out to in when I'm doing applique. So you saw I started with the big general shape of the truck first. Now I'm moving inward to the windshield, and next I'll move inward further onto the frog. So start with your kind of big concepts first and work your way in. That way you can keep reusing your same template over and over. If you were to cut those small inner details out first, you'd have to print out multiple templates because you would be cutting from the inside and losing all your little details. So here I have a reference picture and I'm just matching up the different colored green fabrics that I have. This is a great project for a stash buster if you have a big stash of fabric that you don't know what to do with. Applique is really fun for that because you get to be super artistic and use all different colors and prints of fabric. It's just a lot of fun and you can get rid of a lot of old scrappy pieces that way. So here I've traced kind of the outermost details of the frog and then down to the eyes on my freezer paper. And I'm gonna take just what I need fabric-wise for the frog's body. And another way that you can work with this heat and bond is kind of like a sandwich method, which I'm going to show you here. So I already traced my design on top of my freezer paper, and now I'm cutting out enough of the heat and bond for my frog. I'm going to lay my heat and bond down on the bottom, and you see that kind of bumpy, rough edge that I was talking about earlier here. I'm going to lay that facing up. Then I'm going to lay my fabric right on top of that. And then lastly, I'm going to lay my freezer paper that I drew on, and I'm going to iron it all together all at once. Reason being, it's just going to save us a step later where we don't have to go back and iron the heat and bond on the back of the fabric like I did at the beginning. This is just a slightly quicker method. So now all of this is sandwiched together, so I can go ahead and cut my design out. And by the way, when you're drawing on your freezer paper, it's going to be on the dull side. You want the shiny side to be what adheres to your fabric with your iron. And it's super easy once you cut your shape out like I'm doing here. You just gently peel off that freezer paper and it comes right off. There's no residue left behind. It's perfect for making these applique pieces. All right, and like you can see here, you're just going to gently peel back that freezer paper off the front. Sometimes you can peel the heat and bond from the back, from the corner, but if not, you can gently score it with your scissors. Just make sure you don't go through it and through the fabric. You're going to see that shiny adhesive on the back. That's perfect. I'm doing kind of a dry fit here to see how I like the frog and realizing that he needs a little bit more of a curve to him to fit in that window properly. So I'm just going to kind of keep cutting and reshaping until I get the shape I want. Now that I have Frog exactly the size and shape that I want him, I'm just going to place my iron over him for a few seconds in each spot. Make sure he's nice and secure. What this is doing is making it where my pieces are nice and secure and strong so that when I take them to the sewing machine, they're not falling off my main piece. They're staying put until I can stitch them together on the sewing machine. So I'm just going to keep working like this, again, out to in or inward. You want to start with your bigger pieces first and then add those smaller details last. That way you can keep using your same template and you're not cutting it all to bits where you need multiple templates printed or drawn out. So now that I've done his main body, I'm going in for his eyes, starting with the white part of the eye, then the black part, the pupil, and then the white highlight. So you'll see me kind of working from outward to inward here. Once you have your main character or whatever it is you're wanting to applique ready to adhere to your main piece of fabric, you're just going to turn your object over that you've created, in my case, Little Blue Truck, and you're going to adhere Heat and Bond all over the back of it. So I started with a large kind of main piece for the main body, and then I pieced smaller bits for the back of the tires here and the wheel wells. I'm lightly scoring it after I've adhered it on, just like we did for the rest of the applique on the front, and I'm gently peeling it off now. This white fabric was just a plain piece of white fabric that I had laying around on the bolt. You can do whatever size fabric you want. I would recommend cotton for this process. You can't really do this method of applique for something like fleece because it'll melt the fabric when you put your iron onto it. So I do like using cotton for any type of applique involving heat fusible material like Heat and Bond like we're doing here. So I'm just gently peeling off all of the Heat and Bond and getting my piece ready to put onto my fabric. I personally like to center it onto the fabric. So you can kind of see that center line where I had folded the main piece of white fabric, and I'm going to line Little Blue Truck up centered on that line. But applique quilts, like I said earlier, are really kind of artistic and fun, so do whatever you want with yours. All right, once you get all that Heat and Bond peeled off, go ahead and flip your piece over and put it exactly how you want it on your main background piece of fabric. Make sure that there's, no wrinkles or anything like that in it. And then take your iron and you're going to iron all over your piece, making sure that you're ironing out any creases to the best of your ability and that things are laying just how you want them.
All right, now we're going to go ahead and start actually securing our pieces down to our quilt top. So this is Raw Edge Appliqué. What I mean is we're leaving these edges of our pieces raw. You can see they're kind of tattered here. There's some fraying. In other applique techniques, you would perhaps turn these edges under and then iron them down so that they're nice and turned under and have what we call like a finished edge. Or if you think about like your quilt binding, that's a finished edge. It's got a nice clean edge around it. So this is Raw Edge Applique. Your fabric is very much raw. There's a couple of things that you could do here. You could do a zigzag stitch that's going to zigzag down. You could do a blanket stitch that's going to look kind of like these half squares going right along the edge, just a line and then in and a line and then in. I like to do a combination of the two depending on how big of a piece I'm working with, and I'll kind of show you that in a minute. I don't typically use a straight stitch, especially when I'm working with cotton, because if I use a straight stitch on here, anything that falls to the right of that stitch is still going to be fraying like this. I don't know if you can really see, but there's little loose pieces here of fabric coming off. That is going to fray quite a bit, especially once this piece gets washed. Now, there are some quilts where maybe you want that look. I recently made a baby blanket where I made a hot air balloon and I purposely had that fraying, that applique. I was kind of inspired by this Pottery Barn quilt, and they had done kind of like a chenille technique. So sometimes it's okay to have that if that's the look that you're going for. But a lot of times with Raw Edge Applique, we want to use a stitch that's going to kind of capture that edge and enclose it enough to where it's going to minimize fraying, because you want the quilt to last a long time. You don't want it pulling apart at the edges and getting worse and worse and worse every time you wash it. So for me personally, my personal preference is with these larger sections to use a blanket stitch on my machine. And then with these smaller items like this pupil, I like to do a small zigzag. The blanket stitch is a little bit harder to keep lined up because it's going down and in and then down and in. It's not just kind of staying along, even though a zigzag, it's going back and forth. It's still more like a straight line. And I just feel like a zigzag is easier to control and less pronounced when you're talking about smaller areas. So that's my personal preference, and that's kind of what you'll see me do in this video. So I'm going to start with this windshield here, if you will. And I am going to set my machine to a blanket stitch. And I like to set mine to a 3mm personally on this. So I'm going to line my needle up where it's going to come right on the edge of that fabric and catch it. And so let me kind of show you that here. And I'm always going to backstitch, make sure we're nice and secure. And I'm just going to go right down along that edge. Now, sometimes with the blanket stitch too, you might come outside the edge just a hair. That's okay. It's never going to be perfect. And even if you were to come inside of the raw edge a little bit, it happens. Again, it's not going to be perfect. You might have some minimal fraying here and there. It's okay. So I'm just going to work my way down this line. And all we're doing right now is securing our applique pieces to our quilt top. So I've gotten down to the bottom edge. I'm just going to turn my piece here. And kind of continue along. I really like the blanket stitch for when I have a little bit more of maybe a jagged piece. So when we were cutting our pieces out earlier, when you're kind of cutting 2, 3 plus things at one time, the fabric that's on the bottom can kind of shift while you're cutting it. And so even though the top fabric looks really crisp and clean, sometimes the bottom piece that you're cutting gets a little messed up in the process and cut a little bit more jagged. So I really love the blanket stitch for helping to kind of hide that. So you might have noticed the bottom of this window originally was cut pretty jagged down in here, but with our blanket stitch, it's really hidden that pretty nicely. So I'm just going to keep moving along. And I'm just going to back stitch again to make sure that it's nice and secure and cut my threads. So now this whole piece is nice and secure to my quilt top. And cut these threads. A lot of these loose little threads will kind of wash out in the washing machine. I'm not real worried about it, and I can work on clipping those later. But as you can see, we have a nice, neat blanket stitch. So what I was saying earlier is that there's a stitch that comes down and a stitch that comes in, and then another one that comes down and in and down and in. And so it just looks nice and neat all the way around, and it's encapsulated that edge nicely to where when we go to wash this edge isn't going to fray even further now. So I'm going to continue on doing my blanket stitch, and then when I get down again to these finer details, I'll kind of pop on and highlight and show you that I'm using the zigzag stitch. At this point, I am going to go ahead and switch to a zigzag. And I do like to keep it pretty small so it's not as noticeable. So I'm keeping mine at 1.4 millimeters. All right, so I'm going to start down here and at the bottom of the eye. And I'm going to keep as close to the edge as possible and do a back stitch. I'm trying to keep kind of close to the edge so that I don't have a whole bunch of lines of thread basically coming off of the eyeball where from far back it looks all crazy. So you can see now our eye is secured with a zigzag stitch, so it kind of goes in, out, in, out, in, out. A little bit different from a blanket stitch, so you notice that the raw edge isn't completely closed by a line, whereas our blanket stitch is. There's a line here and then it comes in, and then a line and then it comes in. Here you're kind of leaving some of that raw edge exposed, so you might get a little bit of fraying, a little bit more than you would with a blanket stitch, but it's still going to be okay. Now with the pupil, I'm literally just going to do 1 or 2 stitches. Otherwise it's going to run off into the black part of the eye. I'm trying to get it lined up right on top of it. Or I guess not the pupil, but like the little white highlight in the eye, if you will. All right. Now I got my eyes on there. You can see up close. And I'll cut these loose threads for a crisper look here. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to Little Blue's eyes, because I still am on white thread. So with eyes or really anything circular, you just kind of have to keep lifting that presser foot pretty often and turning. Make sure your needle's down when you go to turn. That way, you're not shifting your piece around and accidentally moving your needle to the wrong spot. The Little Blue Truck Christmas book is our favorite Little Blue Truck book. So we opted to put a wreath on Little Blue Truck. So I will go ahead and change my thread color to green to coordinate with both of those. All right, now one thing I will say as I go to change threads and do more of Little Blue's details, I needed kind of a dark contrasting fabric for the wheel wells here. And the only fabric that I could find that kind of met that requirement was a t-shirt that I had bought years ago to make something, I don't remember what, with my Cricut. And I knew I wasn't going to use it when I found it in my stash today, and so I used that shirt as the fabric that I would use for these wheel wells. T-shirt fabric, by and large, typically is not going to fray because usually it's more of a knit so that it can stretch because it's apparel, something we wear. So for this, I probably am going to do more of a straight stitch because the other thing about t-shirt fabric, I don't know if you can see how much that stretches. Whereas quilting cotton, you can see this here, it's not really budging much, not really stretching. If I try to do something like a zigzag or a blanket stitch on this, because that blanket stitch is going in and down and the zigzag stitch is going in and out, it's going to kind of pull on this and distort it. And this side might be longer than this side with it. And so I'm just going to do a straight stitch because it's not going to fray anyway because it's t-shirt material. And I think that's just going to be an easier stitch for getting this done and holding it down.
All right, so at this point, everything has been securely stitched down to our background fabric. At this point, you could call it good and just quilt it or turn it into a light blanket by laying wrong sides together and stitching kind of 3 sides around and leaving an opening to turn it inside out as I'm kind of motioning here. And then you could just top stitch it down kind of into a light blanket. I am going to quilt mine, but before I quilt it, I'm going to embellish mine a little bit. I ended up deciding to add a bow to the wreath, which I was going to hand embroider it at first, but trying to hand embroider through that Heat and Bond was super thick and I just couldn't do it. I also ended up adding lines to the grill like I'm motioning here via machine, and then I am going to add Christmas lights around since it's kind of blank and boring right now. So I'm going to do all of that by machine in a minute. This is just to say that you can further embellish beyond just the applique with some hand embroidery or some fancy stitches from your machine, whatever you want to do. Because I opted to add a few more details before quilting, I'm just using a water-soluble pen that will wash out in the washing machine to draw some lines to guide my stitching for Christmas lights. I'm also using a Hera marker and ruler here to create some straight lines in Little Blue Truck's grill, where I'm going to go in with some lighter colored heavyweight thread to add those kind of design features and just make this piece stand out a little bit more and give it a little bit more of an artistic look. After you have completely finished the top and you have it just how you want it as far as any of the design features, you're just going to assemble it as any normal quilt. So I'm going to go ahead and baste all of my pieces together. So my backing, my batting, and my appliqued top piece. Because this is something that I'm just using for my home with my own child, I went ahead and used a twin sheet that we had laying around, just a flat sheet, as my backing. And I already had some of the batting, so this project actually ended up being very cost effective. That's something else I like about these quilts. You don't have to have necessarily a bunch of different coordinating fabrics to make specific blocks. You can just kind of take what you have around the house or that's already in your stash and create something really fun and really customizable. I have been absolutely loving this 12 weight thread from Sulky. It's really strong and durable, and I love the way that the stitches pop out in my pieces when I use them to kind of accentuate my quilting. Just like with a traditional type of quilt, I do like to start quilting more from the center. That way I can kind of smooth out any wrinkles as I go off to the sides, so that I'm not getting a bunch of bunching on the back of the fabric or on the top. So I am starting in the center of the piece with Little Blue, kind of securing him to the back of the quilt first. And then in a few minutes, you'll see me kind of go throughout the quilt, again, starting in the center, but from the top down more in the white area. And I've been kind of doing more of a whimsical pattern for these types of quilts where I just kind of let my walking foot take the lead and do some very light curves. I do love to free motion quilt, but with these, I don't want to compete with the applique pieces that I've made for the eye's attention, if you will. So you're kind of seeing here, I leave my lines very simple, very flowing, and just easy. So that is it, guys. We have our little blue truck. We have our Christmas lights that we stitched on by machine, the cool wavy quilting lines. I hope you enjoyed this project. Super fun, very simple for beginner quilters, or if you need a good stash buster. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.